Here at Nightmare Masterclass, I strive to interpret great works in the realm of uncanny and existential horror. But I would be absolutely remiss if I didn't stop for a minute to give credit to one of the most influential television shows of all time, a little sci-fi fantasy anthology series called The Twilight Zone.
You unlock this door with the key of imagination. Beyond it is another dimension. A dimension of sound. A dimension of sight. A dimension of mind. You're moving into a land of both shadow and substance, of things and ideas. You've just crossed over into the Twilight Zone.
The original series ran from 1959 to 1964. It spawned books, comics, a feature film, and 2 revival series. We're coming up on New Year's, a time when the SyFy channel features their annual Twilight Zone marathon. Personally, I've considered it a very special seasonal occasion since they started doing this. The Twilight Zone is the perfect show to marathon before the new year. It's a show that is unabashedly didactic. Each episode is meant to give viewers a lesson or a new perspective to consider. I thought now would be an appropriate time to give my due respects to the highly revered show, a program that undoubtedly influenced a myriad of films and TV shows that we all know and love. We'll explore how the show came to be, and after that, I'll dissect a few classic episodes. Stay tuned, and you'll find that many of the themes explored by this groundbreaking program are still relevant today. Thanks for watching, and be sure to check out the Twilight Zone Marathon on the SyFy channel. Over the course of a few days, they'll broadcast over 40 hours of mind-bending suspense and intrigue. So, how did the Twilight Zone come to be? Well, none of it would have been possible without creator Rod Serling. Serling was born in 1924 to a Jewish family in New York. After graduating high school, he enlisted in the U.S. Army. Understandably, Serling sought to fight the Nazis in Europe, but life had other things in store. He ended up becoming a paratrooper in the Pacific Theater. Serling was injured during a battle in the Philippines and later sent home. Nonetheless, he would be haunted for the rest of his life by what he had experienced during that brutal campaign. Looking forward, we'll notice certain trends in his later work that might give some indication as to his feelings about war. After coming home, Serling learned to channel his frustrations into writing, an activity that came to be his greatest passion. As is often the case, he wasn't initially successful as a writer. Later on in his career, Serling mused of receiving 40 rejection letters during his early pursuit of the craft. But life would eventually take a fortuitous turn for the young veteran. Serling's first major break came in 1955 when Kraft Television Theater picked one of his scripts, a business drama called Patterns. It was a hit with critics and audiences alike. In fact, Patterns was so successful, it was televised and performed twice, an unprecedented event at the time. Serling went on to write for Playhouse 90, an anthology drama series on CBS. Of particular note is his work Requiem for a Heavyweight, the story of a washed-up boxer and his morally bankrupt manager. This too proved to be a critical success for Serling, this time earning him a Peabody Award. But success came with great frustration for the prolific writer. In these pioneering days of television, sponsors often acted as censors. They worked to ensure their products were being presented in a positive light, though the cost was often the very integrity of the work itself. Serling was nicknamed the angry young man of television due to his continual disagreements with networks and sponsors over matters of censorship. Prior to the creation of The Twilight Zone, Serling clashed with CBS when the network demanded heavy edits to his script for a Playhouse 90 feature called A Town Has Turned to Dust. It was initially conceived to be the dramatization of the Emmett Till story. Emmett Till was a black 14-year-old boy who was brutally lynched in 1955 after allegedly whistling at a white woman. Due to the perceived controversial nature of the story, CBS insisted that it be dramatically changed. Serling later said, "They chopped it up like a roomful of butchers at work on a steer." Indeed, much to his frustration, the network suggested revisions would leave the script virtually unrecognizable. In Serling's crusade against censorship, he would often cite another horrifyingly brazen example: the revisions made to a Playhouse 90 episode called Judgment at Nuremberg. Written by Abby Mann, the feature was a dramatization of the tribunals held after World War II, carried out to prosecute Nazi war crimes. However, certain topics proved to be contentious, specifically references to the gas chambers used by Nazis to systematically murder prisoners of the concentration camps. Due to the American Gas Association being a sponsor of the show, the very mention of any gas in relation to this kind of violence was considered commercially untenable. The concern was that these references might leave Americans with the negative opinion of natural gas used for heating and cooking in their own homes.
Today, more people than ever are doing the laundry with gas.
When the episode aired, any mention of gas chambers was cut from the live broadcast, leaving the audience with jarring periods of silence. Allow this transgressive absurdity to sink in for a minute. A historical fact about the Holocaust, a time when millions of innocent people were brutally and methodically murdered, was censored because, in someone's mind, it might have affected the bottom line of American gas companies. It's unclear whether it was CBS or the American Gas Association who demanded the changes, but nonetheless, it is perhaps one of the most damning instances of censorship in television history. Serling yearned to explore serious topics, ones not often discussed on TV. As a kid, he was a fan of pulp fiction stories. He decided to combine these two interests into a television show, one that, through the lens of genre conceits, allowed him certain creative liberties.
You've got a new series coming up called The Twilight Zone. You are writing as well as acting executive producer on this one. Who controls the final product? You are the sponsor.
We have what I think, at least theoretically anyway, because it hasn't really been put into practice yet, a good working relationship, where in questions of taste, in questions of the art form itself, in questions of drama, I'm the judge, because this is my medium and I understand it. I'm a dramatist for television. This is the area I know. I've been trained for it. I've worked for it for 12 years. And the sponsor knows his product, but he doesn't know mine. So when it comes to the commercials, I leave that up to him. When it comes to the story content, he leaves it up to me.
Thus, The Twilight Zone was born. Serling considered the show to be a commercial pursuit, distinct from his previous artistic endeavors. In interviews, he claimed to consider the series a work of mere entertainment.
Is pre-censorship, though, involved? Are you simply writing easy?
In this particular area, no, because we're dealing with a half-hour show, which cannot probe like a 90, which doesn't use scripts as vehicles of social criticism. These are strictly for entertainment.
These are pot boilers.
Oh, no, I wouldn't call them pot boilers at all. No, these are very adult, I think high-quality, half-hour, extremely polished films. But because they deal in the areas of fantasy and imagination and science fiction and all of those things, there's no opportunity to cop a plea or chop an axe or anything.
Well, you're not going to be able to cop a plea or chop an axe because you're going to be obviously working so hard on the Twilight Zone that, in essence, for the time being and for the foreseeable future, you've given up on writing anything important for television, right?
Yeah. Again, this is a semantic thing. Important for television, I don't know. If by important you mean I'm not going to try to delve into current social problems dramatically, you're quite right, I'm not.
Perhaps Serling was just being humble. Ironically, his work on The Twilight Zone helped to legitimize science fiction as a more serious genre, paving the way for future filmmakers. Due to the fantastical nature of the program's framework, Serling now had the creative freedom to explore some of the more controversial topics that networks and sponsors had previously worked to stifle. The science fiction and fantasy elements of The Twilight Zone were, perhaps, the creator's alluring way of getting around censors. He essentially used the genre to veil his own incisive commentary about world events. The result was one of the most influential and thought-provoking shows in television history. Take, for instance, an episode written by Serling himself called The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. It's the 22nd episode of the first season, and it aired on March 4th, 1960. The story takes place in a normal suburban town, a familiar setting for many viewers. Towards the beginning of the episode, a strange noise can be heard. Some residents spot an object whirling across the sky. They hear a strange noise. It could be a meteor. It could be an alien spaceship. They don't know. The residents of Maple Street then find that their electric appliances no longer work. Cars won't start. One kid seems to think a hostile group of aliens are to blame. It's a natural thought for a kid to have, especially one who's well-versed in comic book storylines. The adults shrug off this notion, though, as events progress, they all start to give it a little more credence. A man named Les is singled out. Strangely, his car starts. This makes Les highly suspect in the eyes of his neighbors. One woman is quick to point out Les's strange penchant for looking up at the sky at all hours of the night. Les defends himself and explains that he merely suffers from insomnia, but the seed of suspicion has been planted. Arguments ensue. Tensions between the people of Maple Street gradually escalate. Another man who had previously ventured off looking for help is shot upon his return. His shadowy visage had taken a particularly excitable neighbor by surprise. Things only get worse from there. Eventually, the situation devolves into complete chaos. Violence erupts. A complete riot ensues. Cut to a nearby hilltop. It turns out that it was aliens all along. The humanoid figures muse to one another about how easy it was to create paranoia and chaos among the humans, the weak-minded residents of Maple Street. They note that the world is full of Maple Streets and state their intentions to move from one to the other, thereby destroying all human civilization. Serling's closing narration sums it up better than I can.
The tools of conquest do not necessarily come with bombs and explosions and fallout. There are weapons that are simply thoughts, attitudes, prejudices, to be found only in the minds of men. For the record, prejudices can kill, and suspicion can destroy. And a thoughtless, frightened search for a scapegoat has a fallout all of its own. For the children, and the children yet unborn. And the pity of it is that these things cannot be confined to the Twilight Zone.
This episode touches upon a dark facet of human nature, the tendency to view outsiders as a distinct threat. But moreover, it touches on the human penchant for succumbing to paranoia when faced with threatening circumstances. Just a few years prior, McCarthyism had plagued the country. Fear of the communist threat ran rampant. Thousands of Americans were accused of being Soviet operatives. SyFy of the past had worked to stoke the anxieties of the American people in myriad ways. War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells is one of the earliest examples of a narrative that entails the human race in conflict with an alien species. And while there are numerous critical interpretations of the work, some involving British imperialism, some more focused on the notion of natural selection, the political subtext of later media iterations was rather blatant.
This could be the beginning of the end for the human race. For what men first thought were meteors or the often ridiculed flying saucers are in reality the flaming vanguard of the invasion from Mars.
Looks like they're going to come out of that gully pretty soon. We'll have to rush our defenses to be ready when they do.
The communist threat was undoubtedly at the forefront of the American consciousness at the time of this film's release. Talk of men from the Red Planets surely evoked fear in the hearts of audiences. Ironically, a book that had been openly critical of the British Empire had been adapted into a film, one which operated essentially as anti-communist propaganda for terrified American viewers. And while their fears may have been well-founded, considering the nuclear arms race transpiring at the time, some films only served to add fuel to an already blistering fire. But The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street worked against stoking such anxieties. And this is part of what makes The Twilight Zone such a compelling series. It was often subversive. It was the voice of reason in a time of hysteria. It went against the grain of societal prejudice at a time when such commentary was in terribly short order. The episode serves to remind us of an important lesson, one taught to us by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance.
There is a greater threat to American values than outside influence, our own fear. The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street provided an apt societal commentary at a time when the country was still reeling from the Russian threat. But even today, it's a prescient topic for somewhat obvious reasons. In their desperate pursuit to make sense of the strange situation, the folks on Maple Street gave in to hysteria. They turned on one another. They singled out their fellow neighbors for arbitrary differences. The episode is called The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, and it turns out that the true monsters were the residents all along. In the crowd's frenzy, they lost sight of both logic and common decency. This type of plot twist is something the Twilight Zone came to be known for, and it's part of the reason the show had such staying power. It subverted expectations. It lured viewers in with a compelling story, one relevant to their own lives, and then it pulled the rug out from under them. This is part of the reason why the show is still strikingly relevant today. 5 Characters in Search of an Exit is yet another classic Twilight Zone episode, though this story presents the viewer with more of an existential quandary than it does a criticism of society. It is the 79th episode of the program, and it aired on December 22nd, 1961. Let's review. An army major wakes up in a large cylinder-shaped enclosure with no recollection whatsoever of who he is or where he's from. He's greeted by a clown, a ballerina, a tramp, and a bagpipe-playing Scotsman. All of them are in the same precise dilemma. They're trapped. The army major tries to reason his way out of the enclosure, though the other characters note that they've already made numerous and varied escape efforts to no avail. Nonetheless, the major desperately attempts every possible means of escape. The tramp's words provide no comfort.
For our purposes, this is the universe, this little room.
The ballerina proposes a number of theories. Perhaps they're on another planet, or maybe they're all just insane. Maybe it's all some terrible hallucination. The hobo speculates that perhaps they've all died and they're in limbo. The bagpiper puts forth the idea that they're all part of someone's elaborate dream. The clown, in his wisdom, notes that there are an infinite number of explanations for their predicament, all of them impossible to verify. Thus, it's pointless to speculate further. The major concludes that they're all in hell. After some time, the major comes up with an escape plan that just might work. He proposes that they form a tower, each of the characters standing on another's shoulders to see if they can reach the top. The plan is nearly successful, but a loud noise causes the enclosure to shake, and their human tower collapses to the ground. But the group's near success only strengthens their resolve. The major uses his sword and scraps of clothing to fashion a grappling hook. Again, they form a tower. The major swings his makeshift grappling hook and climbs to the top of the enclosure. He tries to get a good look of what's outside, but abruptly falls to the other side. The clown laments that the major may have been right. They may be in hell. Cut to a snowy exterior scene.
Dolls for Christmas! Dolls for Christmas!
The final scene displays the 5 characters, all evidently figurines in a toy collection bin for an orphanage. The ballerina holds hands with the major, her eyes filling with tears. The episode, even by today's standards, is a total mindfuck. I can't even imagine what viewers in the 60s must have thought. Even the title, 5 Characters in Search of an Exit, has deep philosophical implications. In part, it's an allusion to No Exit, an existentialist play by Jean-Paul Sartre. No Exit offers a nightmarish vision of the afterlife, a vision in which 3 characters are locked together in a room for eternity, a scenario effectively serving as their own personal hell. But the nature of their damnation does not entail the gruesome means of torture typically associated with that notorious eternal resting place. There is no physical torture, no burning, no severing of precious limbs, no being prodded with sharp objects. The scenario is far more commonplace, and strangely, more sinister as a result. They have been placed together in a room solely to torture one another. As an introvert, this is deeply horrifying to me. By mere virtue of their conflicting personalities, the characters will exist in perpetual agony. The characters are all doomed to forever define themselves in relation to the others in the room. We can't possibly expect the Twilight Zone episode to contain such rich philosophical themes. After all, it's only 20 minutes or so of television. But the episode does put an interesting spin on this intrapersonal dynamic. Despite the major speculation, the characters aren't in hell. We can't fault him for thinking that. It's an understandable assumption to make considering the circumstances. They're trapped with no recollection of who they are. But, again, the truth is more commonplace, and strangely all the more hellish as a result. They are toys. The characters exist solely for the amusement of others. They are objects to be used and discarded at the fickle whims of children. But, unlike No Exit, there's a small glimmer of hope in that turn of events, because perhaps, after all, the characters will be loved and appreciated. And they do have a purpose, even if it's not one they could have possibly imagined. No one asks to be born. We all come into this world struggling for meaning. As it turns out, the Major is no war hero, and so it goes that many children grow up to find their ambitions and optimism are gradually shattered by the mundane, sad facts of the real world. But think about the end of this episode. Yes, it is true that the Major is no war hero, but he may well serve to make a young orphan happy. And really, is there a better purpose than that? All things considered, that's not so bad, is it? It is, after all, in the tedious, mundane aspects of life that we find small but meaningful acts of heroism. And it is in those acts that we can maybe find a bit of solace. It is perhaps the greatest testament to the Twilight Zone's general quality of writing that even today, decades later, not only is it still watchable, but still entertaining and thought-provoking. One wonders what stories Serling would tell in this day and age. What would he make of the dawn of the internet? The war on terror? The surveillance state? One wonders what Rod Serling would make of Donald Trump.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Sorry to keep you waiting. Complicated business. Complicated. Thank you very much. I've just received a call from Secretary Clinton. She congratulated us, it's about us, on our victory. And I congratulated her and her family on a very, very hard-fought campaign. I mean, she fought very hard.
Submitted for your approval one Donald J. Trump, business mogul, reality television star, and now President-elect of the United States of America. He promised jobs. He promised security. He vowed to make America great again. Pundits continually dismissed him, but the media, even while chiding him as a clown and a male chauvinist, continually gave him airtime, only furthering his popularity. Critics cited his lack of political experience and his continual appeal to racial and xenophobic dog whistles. Some voters disagreed, enough, in fact, to get him elected to the highest office in the land. They took him up on his offer to make America great again. But what is the nature of this supposed greatness that Trump espouses? Is the course he sets out for America one destined for greatness? Or is it headed in another direction? One perhaps located somewhere in the Twilight Zone. I'll close with a quote from Serling himself. I happen to think that the singular evil of our time is prejudice. It is from this evil that all other evils grow and multiply. In almost everything I've written, there is a thread of this. A man's seemingly palpable need to dislike someone other than himself. Wise words from a wise man. That wraps it up for this installment of Nightmare Masterclass. In the next horrifying lecture, I deal with the fallout from angry Trump supporters boycotting my YouTube channel. And I assure you, this one gets dark. Stay tuned, and thank you for watching.